to this week's Redeemer's Church podcast.
On the storyline we've been talking about, one of the things you're going to hear me harp on over and over again is how interconnected this storyline is to our lives today, and how we got to make sure we're not just reading the Old Testament as this old historical book of stories, but how it really sets the platform for who we are as God's people as we follow after Him. Today we're going to go through chapter 12. Now the thing about this is where Israel is fleeing Egypt. And they're running, so last week we talked about Moses being called out to go liberate Egypt. And he's now come and done that. They're fleeing. They're about ready to get out of the country. And this is a chapter about Passover. And I thought about this chapter. And I thought, when most people read their Bibles, if they're not serious Bible scholars, they probably would be bored by this chapter. Or they might see it kind of hops around a lot. And it can be kind of confusing. And so today I hope that you get some clarity, because it's really a wonderful chapter that really sets the stage. We are going to skip over the 10 plagues. Many of you know those stories. They're super important, but we're skipping that. We're coming to the 10th plague. And the reason we're doing that is because this is really about our journey as God's people. And the 10 plagues are really important. If you want to know about them, go watch Prince of Egypt. It's probably one of the most accurate movies of Moses. Unfortunately, it's a cartoon, but it's the only Exodus story where they're not white, blue-eyed British people. So go watch Prince of Egypt if you want the rest of this story. But today we're skipping ahead to the Passover, and where we find ourselves is God is about to redeem them. He's about to let them leave Egypt, and He has to set up a system in which they got to remember what God is doing. And there's a reason He's doing this. So today's message is called Recipe for Redemption. And He's going to use a system of symbols to talk about how they are to remember how they are redeemed. And this is important because He realizes that we easily forget what God has done. We easily forget why we are redeemed and what we're redeemed for. And so He uses these three ingredients for redemption. If I had to describe the Christian life, maybe y'all can understand this, I would say it's amnesia and deja vu. You understand what I'm saying? It's kind of like you say, hey, I think I forgot this before. We keep repeating these cycles of amnesia, deja vu. I know God's the most important thing in the world. I know that I cannot do it in my own power, and I got to trust in Him, but I think I forgot this before. Now I remember that my life's hit rock bottom, and now I remember I got to trust in Him. Okay, I think I've been here before. And God knows that's the nature of His people, that as we're on this journey, that is the nature of how we live and what we do. So He develops these three ingredients for redemption. So as we get into chapter 12, we're going to read about the instructions for remembering so that we don't fall off this course we're on together. One of the things God does is He tells Pharaoh what is going to happen. He does it in Exodus 4. He says, this is what the Lord is going to do with the 10th plague. He says, Israel, my firstborn son, I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. But you refused to let him go. So I will kill your firstborn son. This is the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. If you'll follow with me. This is the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, but the thing we have to remember is He warned them with 9 plagues after this. He told them before all the other plagues that this was going to happen. So they had all these chances to let His people go. One of the things that's important about this verse is God calls Israel His firstborn. This term firstborn is really important. It's used throughout the whole Bible. It really denotes this. It has this connotation of special privileges. It has this connotation of having a closeness with God. Other cultures believed it was a sign of virility, that the opening of the womb for the firstborn was a sign of virility, of God's blessing, of divinity on this child. In fact, so many people believe that in different cultures that this child belonged to God so much that they would actually sacrifice children. It's a little intense. They would actually sacrifice children. So what would happen is God is proving He is the owner of life in this story. So Egypt is about to lose their firstborn, and God says, you are my firstborn, but in God's kingdom, He doesn't require sacrifice of your children. He's going to redeem him. And we're going to walk through what that word means, that redemption of your firstborn. So what is a redeemer? A redeemer means to be bought back. To be redeemed means to be bought back. It means somebody has taken ownership of something that I hold dear, and I am going to go buy it back at a high price. So when God calls Israel his firstborn, he's talking about his special relationship with them, his special closeness to them, that he is the owner of their life, and he is going to provide a means of redemption, a means to be bought back to him. So then God, as we go into chapter 12, God reminds Israel what's about to happen. He's reminding them about this 10th plague. He says, on that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. So God reminds them of the 10th plague. So after he tells them, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to take the firstborn, he says, but you're going to be able to sacrifice a firstborn lamb. Instead of you losing your firstborn, the Israelites are going to be able to sacrifice a firstborn lamb. And if they take their blood and they put it over the doorway, he will pass over them. He will protect them. And he will redeem them from this death. But I think one of the most important things about this is if they don't do this act of faith of putting the blood on the doorsteps, their fate is the same as the Egyptians. Yes, they are God's people, but their fate is the same as the Egyptians unless they do this act of faith, this act of redemption that God is calling them to. So without this sacrifice, they are on course for the same destruction. So in remembrance of their redemption, so God is redeeming the Israelites, and today they still practice this actually, but they were redeemed, and they realized that God has taken ownership of our life. And so they have a practice where they understand that this life belongs to God because he has redeemed us. So they would actually have chapter 13 says, consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal. So here God is saying, you belong to me. And so this word consecrate in Hebrew means you have this divine specialness about you, but it also means you are going to be forfeited for the service of the sanctuary. You're going to have to give your child up for service to the sanctuary. Today, Jews actually still practice this as a way to remember who owns life. Who do we really belong to? They have this practice called Pidyon Haben. And in this practice, what they do is they come up to a Cohen or a rabbi, and they say, with their firstborn son, and they hand it to the rabbi. And the rabbi says to them, do you want to give me your firstborn son for service to the sanctuary, or do you want to redeem him? And they go, well, I want to redeem him. And so they have to give 5 shekels, because in the Bible and Numbers, if they wanted to redeem their firstborn son from the sanctuary, they had to give 5 shekels. So they give 5 shekels or 5 pieces of silver to redeem their firstborn son. And this is a sign to say, God owns you, but he has redeemed us back into our family. Now, however, if they become teenagers, then you go, hey, can I get them shekels back? Right? I'm thinking that right now. But the main point is, how much would you give to redeem your child? There is a high price to our redemption, and God is willing to pay that. And it's going to require a perfect substitute, a very high price. So as we go into chapter 12, it's really about God's love. You're going to hear about death. You're going to hear about some crazy things. But it's really about God's love and protection on those designated as his firstborn, and how their lives are redeemed at a price. So as we talk about the 3 ingredients of redemption, these ingredients, the directions for these ingredients are how we are to be redeemed and how we are to do after we're redeemed, what we're supposed to do. So follow along, because this is important for our lives. The storyline of Exodus is the storyline of our lives. The recipe we're going to read about is the recipe of our lives as well. So in verse 3, God tells the Israelites how to redeem them from the plague for the firstborn. In verse 3 it says, take a lamb for his family, 1 for each household. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. In verse 46, it tells us that they can be redeemed by this perfect lamb. And it can have no defect. It can have no inadequacies. And in verse 46, it tells us there can be no broken bone. And that's going to be important later. In verse 6, it says, all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood, put it on the sides and the tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. And lastly, in verse 8, it says, that same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. See, this verse right here introduces the 3 ingredients for our redemption, the 3 symbols for our redemption. The ingredients are 1 cup of blood of lamb, 1 bunch of bitter herbs, and 1 slice of bread, no leaven. And there's meaning behind these. These are symbols, and that meaning is where we're going to find how it applies to our life today. So again, I told you, this chapter can get a little weird. Maybe it's a little boring, but it's not. Once you start seeing how it's a platform for our journey, it's pretty amazing. So today we're going to break down what all of these symbols mean, and then God's going to give us the directions of how to use these for our redemption, to stay in walking with Him. So let's look at the first ingredient. Verse 13 says, "The blood will be a sign for you on the houses and where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." God's redemption requires a perfect sacrifice for His imperfect people. And here's the one thing I want to point out. It is not the blood that's like some magic trick. It's not just some weird symbol in this old book. It's not the blood that's the magic trick. It's that, do you believe me enough to take this blood of this perfect lamb and put it on your doorway? Because here's the deal. If you had killed this lamb, if you kept the blood in a little bucket in your house and he passed by, you know what's going to happen? You're still going to die the same fate of Egypt. Because it wasn't the blood itself or the sacrifice itself. It was the faith in the blood. It's, do you have faith that is obedient? Do you believe enough that you're going to trust me that if you put this on there, I'm going to pass by and redeem you and protect you and shield you? See, belief has to be proven in our actions and obedience. See, we've grown up around this culture of thinking belief is this mental acquiescence. And it is to a certain extent, but except belief is proven by your obedience. Let me give you an example. Anybody like the Raiders? All right, good. All right, so I'm in a house. We're watching the Raider game. And somebody comes in and yells, "Fire!" I jump out the window. Sergio stays in watching the Raider game. Who believed and who got saved? Heck no. Who believed and who got saved? Me. Because I believed there was a fire. I jumped out the window. And as usual, it's obvious that the Raiders fan is not saved. Isn't it? Amen? Amen. It's obvious. The one who's saved is the one who jumped out. The one who believed is the one who knew it's time to get out. Right? And then this word says, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." This word "pass over," it's not this dismissive, I'm going to skip over you, I'm just going to go around you. It's an active protecting. It's a shielding. It's, I'm going to shield you from the same fate that the gods and the Egyptians are going to face based on your act of faith. We can get this connotation by reading Isaiah 31. We can understand it a little better. It says, "Like birds hovering overhead, the Lord Almighty will shield Jerusalem. He will shield it and deliver it. He will pass over it and rescue it." They use the same word here. And so behind this is this idea of being shielded, being protected. And I think this is important. The reason I'm pointing this out is this is kind of a macabre story. It's about death and death of these firstborns. And I think this is really important because we have to understand that God, first off, sent 9 plagues to warn them. Just let my people go. And they didn't. And He had to get His people out because they were promised that they were going to lead the nations in knowing God and be a light to the world. And out of their lineage, we know, comes Jesus Christ. So He has to free them. He gave them 9 plagues after warning them, and they still didn't follow. And so here, it's not just simply that He's coming through killing all these people. It tells us that He's actively protecting and shielding us, shielding the Israelites. That there is an angel of death or a destroyer that is going to be on this natural course, and that course is happening. But He is actively shielding us and protecting us. And I think that gives us a little bit different of a picture. So God redeemed us. He bought us back through the blood of this firstborn lamb, through the faith in that blood. Does that sound familiar? That sound familiar? So the recipe for redemption, the first ingredient, the first direction for the first ingredient we have is we've got to be redeemed by faith, by an act of faith in the blood. This is a faith by action. I can't impress that enough. See, many of us are like the Raiders fan. So we're so busy in our interest. We're so busy in what we're doing. We're so busy and caught up in what we want, what we're interested in, that we don't really believe Jesus is coming. We don't really believe what we have been called to. Because if we did, we would take action. If we believe the house is on fire, then we're jumping out. And that's a big test of, do we really believe? Next, we're going to take a look at the second ingredient, bitter herbs. So in verse 8, we're going to go back to that. Where after they eat the meat, it says they also ate it along with bitter herbs. If you recall my first sermon, we talked about the slavery of the Israelites. And in verse 4, it says that their lives were bitter with harsh labor. The same Hebrew word used here for bitter herbs, it says their lives were bitter with harsh labor. So there's ancient Jewish literature that tells us that the Jews understood eating of these bitter herbs as a way to remind them of the slavery in which they came from. Because like the amnesiac, deja vu, they have to be reminded constantly of what they came from, of the sin, of the brokenness of their lives. Because if they don't, they forget how bad Egypt was. As we walk through the rest of Exodus, we're going to see how many times they forget just how bad Egypt really was. Anybody like that? You kind of forget how bad your sin was in the past, how much it messed up your life? See, when we forget how bad Egypt was, it looks a lot sweeter than it really is. There was a Puritan preacher named Thomas Watson, and he said, "Till sin be bitter, Christ will never be sweet." Do you get that? Till your sin be bitter, until it leaves a terrible taste in your mouth where you say, I want nothing to do with that. I hated it. It was so terrible in my life. Christ will never be truly sweet. And see, many of you might be finding it hard in your life to be close to Jesus. Maybe you have trouble finding time with Him. Maybe you have trouble finding a way to make this a major part of your life. And maybe, just maybe, it's because sin isn't quite that bitter to you. Because if it was, Christ, the Redeemer, is sweet. You can't help but run towards Him. Amen? See, many do not praise the God of grace with passion because they have a low view of sin. Let me explain what I'm saying. When you really hate sin, when you really hit rock bottom, then you lift Jesus up. Right? I have a friend. He was a drug dealer. He did drugs, sold drugs, pretty well known. And we were friends, and he was coming to the Lord. And he went to church. And he started getting to church, and he started changing his life, and so he became a leader in church. But one of the things I noticed is every time he'd go share his testimony, he'd talk like this, "Man, I was the biggest drug dealer in town. Man, I had all these girls, I had all this cash." And then at the end he'd go, "Oh, it was bad." Was it? And I sat there thinking, this guy, I thought, as I listened to him, I'm like, he's kind of boasting. Well, he's saying, "Oh, it was so bad. I was such a bad person. Man, I had all these women and all this money. I was such a bad person." I'm like, he's boasting about it. I'm like, he's in trouble. He's going to go back to that. And he did multiple times. He'd go back and come back in this cycle. He'd go back and he'd come back in this cycle. Because honestly, the sin was not bitter. It was pretty sweet. I wonder how many of us are like that. When we really hate the sin of our lives, the things that have ravaged us, you can't help but worship God. You can't help it. So if you're having trouble, this is not to be rude, but if you're having trouble, it may be that you haven't yet appreciated the depth of your depravity, the pain that sin brings in your life. If you're having trouble worshiping God. So God's direction for the second ingredient, the bitter herbs, is remember the bitterness of sin. We have to remember how sweet it is to be redeemed. We have to remember how bitter our life of sin has been. And we have to have an active faith in the blood. It's shown by our obedience, and we have to keep fresh in our minds constantly how bitter things were without Jesus. Then there's the third and final ingredient, the unleavened bread. This is the direction we need that God gives us, this symbol that God gives us to remind us to not go back. How to keep ourselves from going back to a life in which we're not pursuing what God has purposed us for. In verse 8, it reminds us that after the meat, they ate the bitter herbs and then bread made without yeast. Now follow along with me. I'm going to read through a few verses here that hop around that have to do with this yeast. Verse 39. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Verse 19 starts, "For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses, and anyone, whether foreigner or native born, who eats anything with yeast must be cut off from the community of Israel. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread." God apparently hates yeast. What is this guy's deal? He hates this stuff. He's making it very clear there is no leaven with leaven. There's 2 reasons, and this is really important. First, there was a fermentation process in which the yeast would have to spread through the dough, and it would take time to ferment and rise. And so what he is saying here is, you don't have time to let it slowly rise. As soon as I redeem you, as soon as you're set free, as soon as I've taken care of the things in your life that are holding you back like Pharaoh, you got to run. You got to get out. You don't have time to sit around and let the dough rise. We get this understanding because in verse 11 it says, "This is how you are to eat it. With your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, your staff in hand, eat it in haste. Eat it fast. It is the Lord's Passover." I had to chuckle a little bit when I was looking at this. The word "with your cloak tucked in" was in the KJV was "gird your loins." I was like, I like that better. Gird your loins. But all of this tells them, are you prepared? Are you ready to run? Are you ready for the great act that I'm about to do? Because as soon as it's done, you don't have time to sit around in it. Get out, because it's coming back for you. As soon as they are redeemed, they got to get out fast. But then the second symbol of yeast is, this is important. Yeast is used throughout the Bible as a symbol for sin. If you recall in verse 19, I said he said there's to be no yeast found in your houses or else you'll be cut off from the community. That sounds pretty serious for just a little bit of bread. But this practice was actually used, the Jews practiced this all the way into the New Testament. So when Paul actually tells us that they are still practicing this, he tells us in 1 Corinthians 5, he says, "Don't you know that a little yeast," he's speaking about sin, and then he uses this as in regard to sin. He says, "Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch." So if you were to leave, and the reason this is important, if you were to leave just a little leaven, then that leaven could get into your other batch that has no leaven, and it could spread because it's so aggressive. If you leave just a little bit, it could spread. And he's saying you cannot have time, you cannot mess around. If you leave a little bit and it accidentally spreads, it's going to take over, it's going to take time to rise, and Pharaoh's going to come back and get you. And you're going to be brought back to slavery. So when God tells them to gird up their loins, which would mean wrapping your robe. So to gird up your loins, they had long robes, and men would wear these long robes. And what would happen is if they had to run, all of a sudden they'd either get tripped up or expose themselves. So they had to take it and tuck it into their belts. So when God tells them to gird up their loins, he's saying, get ready to get out. He's saying as soon as you're redeemed from slavery, from the blood of the Lamb, you've got to get ready to run. So God's direction for the third ingredient is run from your sin towards God's promises. Understand, they've been called to the promised land. They do not have time to mess around. They are not just running out of slavery, they're running towards what God is promising them. You've got to run from your sin towards God's promises. See, many of us who've accepted Christ's sacrifices for our sin, but we've forgotten the bitterness of our sin. We've forgotten just how bad it was. We don't always run from it. We always leave just a little bit around sometimes, don't we? This part's not so bad. I can leave this. And we leave a little bit in our lives, and we allow it to spread aggressively. You know, I got to tell you, I've worked with a lot of churches over the last 10 years, and I've seen these great men, and they were good men, and great leaders. And it happens for everybody, so this applies to everybody. But I've seen some great men, and one of the things that has just gotten to me is year after year, I hear about another great man who left a little bit of sin and was leading God's people. But he left a little bit of leaven. and he fell apart. And it got brought back into this sinful life. They kept leaving just a little bit. They did not flee from their sin for God's purposes. And we're seeing people chewed up because of it. Excuse me. And it's problematic because we keep just leaving a little bit. Men, I'm going to say this. It's time to gird up your loins. Tuck it in and run from sin. It's time to get out. You cannot leave just a little bit. It's kind of like an alcoholic. You can't have just a little bit on your counter, can you, if you're trying to get free? Can you leave a little bit on your counter? There's never just a little bit. And I think a lot of us just play around and we go, that's not so bad. It's going to trip us up and keep us from running towards what God has for us and bring us back to slavery. We must run from something towards something. From sin to what God has asked us to serve for His purposes. So just as we recap, we have been redeemed by the blood, saved from the plague by the faith in the blood of the Lamb. We've been saved by the plague. We have to remember that our lives are bitter in sin, and it's bitter. And we've got to move out fast. Amen? Now, I had a revelation as I was reading this, and I realized, man, I must be really holy. No, for real. Stay with me. I must be really holy. Because if God is saying, if we remember these things daily, that we'll stay on course for His redemption, then I'm like, man, I've been practicing this every day for years. Because when my wife cooks, it is fast, it is bitter, and I'm praying I don't get the plague. And I'm like, this whole time, I thought she was trying to kill me, and she was trying to make me holier. So thank you. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that fast. But we need... I'm not eating today, But seriously, the point is we've got to make this a practice in our life. Do you make this a practice in your life to sit back and recall what God has done and the great price He has paid and the bitterness that you've been redeemed from, that you've been bought back by a high price, and where you're running from and where you're running towards? Are you making it a practice to recall? Because I got to tell you, it is innate in every one of us. I believe the Bible teaches us. It is innate in every one of us that we are bothered by amnesia and deja vu. That we will continue to repeat the same cycles of brokenness. And if you find yourself in that today, it may be because you're not quite remembering the great sacrifice that was done on a frequent basis. That you're not quite remembering the bitterness of your sin. As usual, and I hope you never get tired of this because this is my favorite part. As usual, the amazing narrative of Scripture carries forward all the way through Jesus Christ. The Old Testament is not just an allegory. It is pointing to Jesus over and over again and revealing Jesus through the Scriptures. So where Paul tells us, do not leave in your sin, do not leave just a little bit of yeast or leaven, because it will leaven the whole batch. Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Paul makes the connection. The Passover lamb that was revealed as our sign of redemption is now found in Jesus Christ. Isn't that amazing? It's not just some old book, you guys. This is how God is still calling you to maintain your walk, your purpose for Him, and to be redeemed from the slavery that you've been in. God is still calling you to it. So don't let religion normalize it. Today, we're going to take part of a very special thing called communion, but don't let your religion make this so commonplace that this is just something you do once a month. This is a practice God has said you need to recall. You need to do it together. Remember what you've been redeemed from. And if you forget, you're going to keep going back. Is anybody tired of the cycles of our lives? I am. And this is the way to get out of that cycle. And so when we go to the New Testament, Jesus is the Lamb. And this is so amazing. Christ is still practicing this Passover tradition that was implemented 1,500, 2,000 years earlier. He's still practicing it in the New Testament. He sits down with his disciples, but now he adds new revelation. He has new symbolism to the same elements. It tells us in the New Testament in John 1 that Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Paul tells us that God sacrificed his Son for our redemption. Peter tells us that Jesus was a lamb without defect or spot. He was perfect. He was the high price paid for our being bought back. And then John tells us that when he was sacrificed, they did not break a bone in his body. I don't know about you. I know many of you have been raised in church, but maybe this becomes common language. Oh, yeah. It's amazing. Am I the only one amazed by this? It is amazing. You can give it up for God. He is the designer of this Bible. He has intricately put together this symbolism thousands of years in the making and made it come to fulfillment in Jesus Christ. It is amazing. Today, we are going to do communion together. So if those who are serving can come up. But I want this to be a special time of communion. Jesus said in Luke 22, and he took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. And he says, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, given for you. Again, I am the Lamb, given to you for your redemption. Do this in remembrance of me." Do this in remembrance of me. We forget, you guys. Do you have a practice in your life to be remembering? Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." We forget the bitterness of our sin and the promises he has for us. And Jesus commands us through this text to do this in remembrance of him so we can get out of this cycle, to remember his sacrifice. Today we get to remember. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, Passover was a communal event, hence the communion. It was a thing that they did together as a community to talk about the bitterness of their slavery, to remember what God had done. And so what I'm going to ask you to do, if you're not comfortable, you can do it by yourself. But what I'm going to ask you to do is, as you take the elements today, get around with people and pray together. Pray for God to reveal himself in how he's continuing to redeem you. Pray for the bitterness of your slavery and the things you've forgotten. Thank him for the sacrifice that he's made for us. And do it together. And spend some time. I'm not going to do it by taking the bread and then next taking another step for the drink. You do it as you do in your groups. And I want you to pray together. And, I was praying over this service this morning, and I felt like the word God gave me was sincerity. I felt like this word kept coming to my mind that God is speaking is sincerity. And I think we can get so wrapped up in how we do church that we are not sincere. That we don't do it with the depth of really remembering the great sacrifice, because it's become such a rote practice for us. So I challenge you together, reflect, be honest with each other, reflect on the brokenness that you've lived in, on the cycles you maybe live in or have lived in, and thank Jesus because he has been our Passover lamb. If you do not know Christ, if you are not yet a believer, I'm going to stand over here in the prayer area. And I'll pray with you. If you've got questions, I'll pray with you. If you want to know how to get free and stop running through the cycles of this world, I'll pray with you. So I'll stand over there, and the rest of you, please join together as a church. And I want you to begin to practice what Jesus is calling to it today. And then I'll come back and close. All right? Get together for us.
Close here. Just want to challenge you, talk to your family and say, how are we remembering? How are we being honest about the things that got us entrapped in our slavery and our sin? And spend time with them. And one of the things, if there's any major point of this, is when we follow God's recipe here, we worship. Not just on stage on Sunday. When you follow God's recipe, when you remember the price, when you remember what you've been saved from, the natural act is worship. And it's a lifestyle, a daily practice of worship. Because you know the great price that you received to be bought back. There's at the end of chapter 12, the Israelites, the firstborn have died, and Pharaoh says something. He's got a word that I think is perfect for us. Pharaoh says, I'm so fed up with the power of your God. He says, rise up, get out, go worship the Lord. So I'll say that to you. Rise up, get out, and go worship the Lord. Amen.